I'm the HOA president. I can park my car anywhere I want. That includes this driveway. You don't get to tell me what to do on this street. You're going to regret this. I can fine you. I can make this very expensive." Homeowners Association President Lenora Vance marched onto a homeowner's driveway on Alderbrook Lane and threatened immediate towing, daily fines, and a lien over unauthorized parking. What they didn't know, the entire enforcement trail she relied on was fabricated and traced back to her own misuse of HOA authority. A mistake that would put her position and the board's credibility on the line. Before we go further, tell us what city or country you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. Another CTA, if you believe people should respect private property rights, hit the like and subscribe button and join us here on Karen Unhinged. Stanley Timothy, a 38-year-old civil engineer with over a decade of experience in municipal infrastructure and zoning compliance, was standing in his driveway at 214 Alderbrook Lane in the Brook Hollow Estates subdivision, Harris County, Texas, rinsing concrete dust off his hands after finishing a minor drainage adjustment along his property's edge. Stanley wasn't new to property law or boundary disputes. His job required him to interpret land use codes, easements, and municipal enforcement limitations on a near-daily basis. He had bought the home 3 years earlier, verified the survey twice, and made sure his driveway sat squarely within his recorded lot lines filed with the county clerk's office. That was exactly why the gray sedan sitting in the center of his driveway made no sense. It wasn't partially over the curb. It wasn't angled incorrectly. It was fully parked, clean, and deliberate, as if the space belonged to someone else. Stanley paused, studied the vehicle for a long second, then walked back inside, grabbed a notepad, and returned to leave a short message on the windshield. "Private driveway, please do not park here again. No threats, no escalation, just clarity." The car was gone by the next morning, but 3 days later it returned. Same car, same position, same confidence. This time Stanley didn't leave a note. He followed the direction the driver had walked toward, and found himself standing in front of a well-maintained corner house, with trimmed hedges and a polished HOA compliance sign near the mailbox. As he knocked, the door opened almost immediately, revealing Lenora Vance, mid-50s, composed, dressed in a pressed blazer despite the afternoon heat, holding a folder that already suggested she operated on paperwork and authority. "You parked in my driveway," Stanley said, calm and direct. Lenora barely glanced past him toward the street. "It's temporary overflow. The association permits reasonable use of adjacent space." Stanley blinked once. "That's not a thing." "It is when the board authorizes it," she replied, already turning halfway back inside as though the conversation had ended. That was the moment Stanley realized this wasn't confusion, it was intent. The car returned again the following evening. No conversation this time, no note. Stanley pulled out his phone, scrolled through a local towing company he had vetted months earlier for a separate project, and made the call. Within 20 minutes, a flatbed truck rolled slowly onto Alderbrook Lane, its amber lights reflecting off the quiet row of identical houses. The driver stepped out, took one look at the situation, and asked the only question that mattered. "Private property?" Stanley handed him a printed copy of his property survey. "Entire driveway, no easements." That was all the confirmation needed as the truck operator began securing the sedan. The front door across the street flew open. Lenora Vance came storming out. No hesitation this time, no calm composure. "You cannot tow that vehicle," she snapped, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "That space falls under community access during peak hours. You're in violation of HOA guidelines." The tow driver didn't even glance at her. "Ma'am, I answer to property ownership and state authorization, not HOA suggestions." Lenora turned to Stanley, her voice tightening. "If you proceed with this, I will issue a formal violation. Daily fines, escalation to lien if necessary." Stanley didn't raise his voice. "Then make sure it's valid." That single sentence hung there longer than she expected. Because unlike most residents she dealt with, Stanley wasn't guessing. He was documenting. The car was lifted, secured, driven off. Lenora stood there, watching it disappear down Alderbrook Lane, her expression shifting, not to defeat, but toward calculation. "You've just made this expensive for yourself," she said quietly. Stanley didn't respond. He was already walking back toward his house, pulling up a time-stamped folder on his phone, where he had begun logging every interaction, every instance, every detail. And inside that folder, something was already taking shape. Not just a record of a parking dispute, but the early outline of a pattern. Because what Lenora didn't yet realize was that this wasn't the first time her version of authority had crossed into private property. And Stanley Timothy was exactly the kind of person who knew how to prove it. Stanley Timothy thought the towing incident would settle the matter, but it did the opposite. 2 days after the car was taken, a white envelope appeared in his mailbox bearing the Brook Hollow Estates HOA seal. Inside was a formal violation notice signed by HOA President Lenora Vance. The notice claimed Stanley had interfered with community parking access and had authorized an illegal tow of a resident's vehicle. It listed a fine of $250 with a warning that daily penalties would begin if the issue wasn't corrected. At the bottom was a line mentioning a possible lien on his property if he failed to comply. Stanley stood in his kitchen reading it twice. The wording sounded official, but something didn't line up with what he already knew. He walked into his home office, opened his laptop, and pulled up the HOA bylaws he'd saved when he bought the house. He went through the parking section line by line. There was nothing in the rules permitting anyone to use a private driveway. There was also nothing granting the HOA power to fine a homeowner for removing an unauthorized vehicle from their own property. That was when Stanley understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was enforcement with no legal foundation. Later that afternoon, as Stanley stepped outside to take a call, he spotted the same gray sedan again. It sat parked in his driveway as if nothing had happened. Lenora stepped out from the passenger side this time. She closed the door slowly and looked directly at him. "I hope you read the notice," she said. "This doesn't need to get worse." Stanley ended his call and turned to face her. "You parked here again after the last tow." "You created that situation," she replied. "I'm correcting it." "This is my property," Stanley said, keeping his voice steady. "You don't have the right to use it." Lenora crossed her arms. "The board decides what is reasonable for the community." Stanley shook his head slightly. "The board doesn't override property boundaries." Lenora didn't argue further. She simply walked away, leaving the car where it was. Stanley didn't waste time. He called the same towing company once more. The driver arrived, recognized the address, and gave a short nod before starting the process again. This time, Lenora didn't come outside. The car was removed again without interruption. That evening, Stanley added more files to his folder. He saved the violation notice, photographed the car in his driveway, and recorded the exact time of the tow. He also began installing a small camera facing the driveway. It wasn't hidden, but was mounted high enough to capture a clear view of the area. 3 days later, another letter arrived, listing multiple violations. It mentioned improper property use, disruption of community harmony, and failure to comply with board directives. The total fine had now climbed to $600. Stanley read it, then set it down beside the first notice. The pattern was becoming impossible to miss. Each action he took to protect his property was being twisted into a violation by the same person ignoring the rules. That evening, he attended the monthly HOA meeting held at the Brook Hollow Community Center on Ridgeway Drive. Lenora sat at the front with 2 other board members. As Stanley listened, he noticed something important. No one mentioned driveway sharing. No one referenced any rules supporting Lenora's claim. When the floor opened for questions, Stanley rose to his feet. "Can you point to where in the bylaws it says a resident can use another person's driveway?" The room fell quiet. Lenora looked at him, then down at the papers in front of her. "We will review that section and respond formally," she said. Stanley nodded once and sat back down. He already knew the answer. Stanley Timothy stopped reacting after the 3rd violation notice. He didn't reply. He didn't argue. He simply kept recording. The camera mounted above his garage captured everything clearly. Date, time, angle, and a full view of the driveway. Within 1 week, Lenora Vance's gray sedan appeared again. Not once, not twice, but 4 separate times. Each time positioned carefully in the center, almost like a statement. But something else began to stand out. Every time the car appeared, a printed violation notice followed within 24 hours. The timing was far too perfect, too consistent. Stanley went back through his files and lined everything up side by side. The tow receipts, the HOA letters, the camera footage. Then he spotted what most people would have overlooked. The violation notices were being processed before the incidents were even formally recorded. One document listed a confirmed parking obstruction at 3 p.m. The camera footage showed the car actually arriving at 4:12 p.m. Stanley stared at that gap for a long time. That was not a simple error. That was pre-written enforcement. The next step was straightforward. He filed a formal records request through the HOA asking for internal logs, complaint submissions, and approval records tied to his address. Under state law, they were required to respond. They did. And what came back was far from clean. There were no resident complaints filed about Stanley, no reports from neighbors, no board votes approving any fines. Every violation tied to his name traced back to one origin point, Lenora Vance. She had filed each complaint herself, she had approved them herself. And she had issued every penalty entirely under her own authority. Stanley printed everything out. Then he uncovered something even worse. Buried within the records was a towing authorization form signed under the HOA's name, claiming shared access rights to private driveways. It bore Lenora's own signature. But the document carried no legal standing at all. It referenced a bylaw section that simply didn't exist. That meant one thing. She had invented her own rule and enforced it as though it were real. Stanley didn't react emotionally. He organized the documents into one clean file, labeled every piece of evidence, and backed everything up twice. Then he sent a single email, not to Lenora, not to the HOA board, but directly to the County Housing Compliance Office and the State HOA Regulatory Division. Attached were the records, the footage timestamps, the false bylaw reference, and the pattern of self-approved enforcement. No lengthy message, no explanation, just evidence. Because at that point, this was no longer about a driveway. It was about outright abuse of authority. And Lenora Vance had just put it all in writing herself. Stanley Timothy did not have to wait very long. Within 10 days of sending the report, a formal notice was delivered to every resident in Brook Hollow Estates. It was not from the HOA. It came directly from the County Housing Compliance Office. The notice confirmed that a formal investigation had been opened into the HOA's enforcement practices. Lenora Vance tried desperately to stay in control. She called an emergency board meeting at the Brook Hollow Community Center on Ridgeway Drive and told residents there had been a misunderstanding that would be resolved internally. But this time, the room didn't respond the way it once had. People had already seen the notice. Some had already heard about the driveway issue. Others had started quietly asking about their own fines. Stanley attended but didn't speak right away. He simply watched. When Lenora began explaining that every action taken had been within HOA authority, Stanley stood and placed a thin file on the table in front of the board. "Then you won't mind explaining this," he said. Lenora opened it. Inside were copies of the violation notices, the timestamps from the camera footage, and the internal records showing she had created and approved every complaint herself. The room went silent. One of the other board members leaned forward and began flipping through the pages more carefully. "These approvals, there's no second signature," he said. "There was no vote," another added. Lenora tried to respond, but the structure of her authority had already begun to crumble. The documents themselves were simple, clear, and impossible to explain away. 2 days later, the county issued its official findings. The HOA had no legal authority whatsoever to enforce shared driveway access. Every fine issued under that claim was declared invalid. Lenora Vance was formally cited for misuse of authority and filing unsupported enforcement actions. The case was forwarded on for further review at the state level. She resigned before that review could even begin. Every fine Stanley had received was fully dismissed. The entire record of violations against his property was cleared completely. A week later, Stanley installed a simple metal gate at the entrance of his driveway, not out of fear but out of genuine closure. The space grew quiet again, exactly the way it had been before all of this started. No more notices, no more threats, just boundaries that could no longer be ignored by anyone. And a lasting reminder that one person pushing too far can bring an entire system down around them. If you believe people in power should be held fully accountable when they abuse it, hit the like button, subscribe to Karen Unhinged, and tell us where you're watching from. We want to hear your story too.